technology. You know, you never know what's going to happen with this technology. I have no idea sometimes why it does what it does. But here I am. I think I'm on Facebook. Okay. And let me see if I'm on YouTube here. Hey, yay. This is crazy. Anyway, today's show is going to feature my friend Walter Bishop Jr. Originally, Mike Benny was scheduled to do the show today, but Mike lives in Patterson, New York, and
why it does what it
experiences.
But here I am. I think I'm on Facebook.
Okay, there we are on Facebook. So anyway, there was a big storm last night, and Mike's power was knocked off, and so he's not going to be able to join us today. So I decided to focus on my friend Walter Bishop Jr., the pianist, composer, teacher, poet, and today's show is going to be all about Walter. So let's start out with some of Walter's piano, and then I'll come back and I'll talk, and we'll talk, and you're going to learn all about Walter and hear his music. Teacher, poet, and today about Walter. So let's start out with here.
Walter Bishop Jr., right. I had a dream about Walter Bishop Jr. the other night, as a matter of fact. And he appeared to me in sort of like what would be, I don't know if you've ever had any dreams where you may see somebody that you know, but they look a little bit different, but you still know it's them. I don't know if you've ever had that experience or not. Right, so he was in my dream, that it was him, you know. And anyway, Walter Bishop's father was in the music business. I can't recall whether he played drums or, I think he played drums. And anyway, he played with a lot of the New York musicians, senior. And then Walter Bishop Jr., he lived downtown in Harlem, but he used to come up on the Hill. So he hung out with us on the Hill, hung out with Arthur Taylor, myself, Lola. He came up and he would, Andy Kirk. So the Hill was sort of the place to be, you know. You just got on the subway, came up on the Hill, walked around the area, and you'd run into somebody, you know, you run into somebody, one of us hanging around or sitting on the bench, and you know. So Walter Bishop was a very Also, of course, gifted musicians who was one of the first people to transcribe and keep the bop thing going, because a lot of people weren't into bop, but Walter Bishop was a very strong bebop pianist, and he formed a bridge actually between guys that were just learning to play, you know, like Bud Powell, you know, learning Bud Powell. So Bishop was very important, and as you know, he played with Charlie Parker for a long time. And he was a very important musician at that time, and we lost him, of course, recently. It's too bad. But I hope the history books remember him, you know.
has now joined the yard bug in that high place, the higher ground. But let's take a closer look at what caused him to be so prolific. Picture, if you may, the scene was Harlem of a much earlier day. Bedbugs, roaches, crawling up and down keyboards. The whites, the blacks, in and out the cracks. Check your facts. An incredible lot they were. They had their own kingdom. They had their own god. There was a centipede named Art, and brother, he played piano with every part. He became known as God. The king was a mighty gnat named Cole, and he played and he sang like a merry old soul. Then there was Elegant Edward, a firefly, a most illuminating creature. Sophisticated ladies would become his feature, and he would go on to become
the Duke of
that wonderful land that we know of as Ellingtonia. Then there was Bouncing Bill, grasshopper. He had this weird habit of jumping up and down at 1 o'clock each night. He became known as the Count of Swing, but between you and I, he was really king. Amazing Bud Bug, the Hornet. He turned the whole thing around with a machine gun-like sound, struck the keys magically, but alas, would end up tragically in a glass enclosure. Then there was J.P. the honeybee. In his day, he was master, for none could play faster. Fats the horsefly, a funny one. They say he used to waller in gin. Yubi, the termite. 'Tis said he used to eat up piano keys both morning, noon, and night. At least I forget those lightning-fingered ladybugs with names like Hazel, Dorothy, and Mary Lou. Believe you me, they could run up and down with the keys with the best of them, too. So it is said Thelonious learned from the boogie, the stride, and the rag. And then he proceeded to come out of his own personal bag. Well, Thelonious had problems, you see. First of all, he was a bit too deep for the average creep. And I don't think all his friends could be trusted because, lo and behold, Thelonious got busted. Oh, what a drag. And dig the charges. Thelonious assault on stock standards, malicious malpractice, diatonic distortions on boring ballads, and add to that, fornicating with the likes of Liza, Honeysuckle Rose, and Sweet Georgia Brown. Well, fortunately for Thelonious, none of these chicks showed up to put him down. 'Tis my belief that they actually dug the changes he put them through. I know they were never the same since. Well, they managed to slow him down a bit, but he merely went underground to perfect his sound. You see, he might have been slowed down for a while, but he wasn't about to change his style. And wouldn't you know it, soon the scene became imbued with the sounds of Monk's Mood. And even the Finks began to order their drinks straight, no chaser. I mean, from underground artistes, out with the beast, become high priest. Which reminds me, it was in Shakespeare's Hamlet that Polonius was counseling his son, Laertes, about to embark on a trip. The last thing he said, "And this above all things, my son, to thine own self be true." In our lifetime, it would be Thelonious, whose lifestyle would be the embodiment of those words of wisdom. Peer without seer, musical mutineer, he was born to commandeer a new frontier and become known amongst nations for his bold innovations. Well, what more can I say? He lived to love us and left us the evidence.
Walter Bishop Jr. began. Yeah, Bish. Well, watching that stuff brings back a lot of memories. You know, when I was a young guy growing up, first getting into bebop, I came across the name Walter Bishop Jr. in a book about Charlie Parker. I guess I was like 12 or 13. It was a book by a man named Robert Reisner. The title escapes me right now. Maybe it was The Legend of Charlie Parker. We had like little statements for a number of musicians. And Bish wrote something on there, and I ended up hearing Bish with Bird. That was probably his first claim to fame, so to speak, when he became Charlie Parker's pianist in 1951. He grew up in Harlem. He was born October 4th, 1927. His dad was a composer, a songwriter, wonderful man. One of his songs was called "Sex is a Misdemeanor. The less you have, the meaner you get." I think there's some wisdom there. So when Bish was a teenager, he was part of the whole bebop thing that was happening. He would take the train up to Sugar Hill, just a couple of stops on the subway, and hang out with Arthur Taylor and Sonny Rollins and Jackie McLean and Kenny Drew. And they would go down to Minton's Playhouse. They were like 15, 16, 17 years old. This was their playground. This was their world. And Bish was immediately taken by the piano artistry of one Bud Powell. Bud was his idol. In fact, when Bish was a teenager and older, in fact, he used to carry around a picture of Bud Powell in his wallet. And so you hear a lot of Bud in his playing. But sadly, Bish got caught up in that horrible heroin plague that devastated so many in our community. And I know that when he was playing with Bird, he was pretty strung out. And he got busted, and he ended up at Rikers Island, and then he got straight, though, because of the love of his family. Bish's family was from Barbados, and his mother and his grandmother, Sweet Rosa, were very influential in getting, and that kind of family support allowed him to get off of heroin and go back to playing music. Seth says Walter Bishop also always had a gentlemanly attitude to his playing and his persona. Yeah. So I had heard Walter I heard Bish with Bird, and then in the 70s when I moved to New York, he was around the scene. But I went to a party once with a gentleman who was on TV at the time, Bill Boggs. And one of his partners at the time, a gentleman named Richard Dubin, who was Clark Terry's protege, who introduced me to Clark Terry, booked Walter to play this party. I forget who the bass player was. So here I was at this party full of important show business people, and Walter Bishop was the pianist, and I ended up hanging out in the back room with Walter. We became close. Walter told me that no one had written an article about him in many, many years. Would I do one? So I said, sure. I mean, I wasn't a jazz writer at the time, but I interviewed Bish, and I sent it into Downbeat magazine, And that was the first thing I ever did that was printed in February 1977, called Jazz Warrior Marches On. That was my entree into the world of jazz writing. And that just increased. For a couple of years there, I just did a lot of articles. That was the beginning of the whole thing with the Heath brothers and Sonny Rollins, all the different articles they wrote. But Bish and I became very close. And at that time, Bish was, I don't say he was scuffling, but early, mid-70s, not a great time for jazz, straight-ahead jazz, for beboppers. Of course, he had evolved as a musician greatly. In fact, he developed something called the Study in Fourths. He wrote a book called The Study in Fourths that became very influential with a lot of musicians picking up on that. Herbie Hancock was one, and Benny Maupin, and a much beloved character. But because New York wasn't happening, Bish moved to L.A. In the early 70s and did some playing out there, but couldn't get it together. And there was one incident that he told me about where he said that he was playing at some club in L.A. and it was just disgusting. The ashtrays had cigarette butts from bands that were there 2 or 3 gigs ago, and he couldn't take it anymore. So he was married to Valerie at that point. He left L.A. and he went to New York and went back to New York. Didn't tell anyone he was there. Checked into the Americana Hotel. Decided he was going to commit suicide. But before that, he had some cash. I think he had $100, and he decided he was going to go up to Harlem to the street, one of the streets where he used to hang out with it, where he was a junkie, and pass out like $10 bills to all the junkies on the street, because when he was a junkie, that was his dream for somebody to come along and give him some bread. So he gave these junkies like $10 bills, which back then was like maybe $50, mid-70s. And then he went back to the Americana Hotel. He ate a lot of sleeping pills. He thought that was it. Luckily, a cleaning woman came into his room at 6 o'clock in the morning, discovered him, and went to the hospital. His stomach was pumped. He survived. He woke up in the hospital surrounded by his family. He realized that life was worth living. And that was the beginning of a resurgence. He got it together. He moved into Manhattan Plaza. I remember when he moved in 77. That was, at that time, the first artists' apartment building where artists, if they passed all the applications, could live in a really nice place for reduced rent. A lot of musicians lived there. Renee McLean, Roger Rosenberg, Dexter Gordon, Charles Mingus, a whole lot of people. It was a wonderful scene there in the late 70s. It's still there. I don't know who lives there now. I'm sure the rents are a lot more. But Bish began to work a little bit more. He had different groups during the time. I remember one of his bands, he had Ricky Ford on tenor, a very young, maybe 18 years old, Marcus Miller on bass from Queens, and Kenny Washington on drums, vocalist Carmen Lundy, percussionist Myra Casales. I forget who the bass player was in that group. Was working with that group. He also Walter introduced me to his friend, another Bud Powell disciple and bebopper, Walter Davis Jr., who's was a fantastic pianist, entirely different style, another larger-than-life personality. They worked some piano duo gigs, Mark Borganelli's place, the Jazz Forum. That was memorable. And at that time, Walter started to get into more teaching. After Jackie McLean started the jazz department at the University of Hartford, Walter would go up there and teach. And but never a big name, never a tremendous success, but somehow survived playing the music. We did a video together. It was the first video. I was out of video for a while, back in 1987, where he talked about his theory of fourths, and also played some of his compositions. So I'm going to show that video now. It's kind of crude, but it's a good. And also, he was a little bit strung out at that point. I mean, he was off and on with heroin the rest of his life. I think he was on methadone at this point. But here's some of his solo piano playing. Yeah, Bish wrote some great stuff. One of his compositions was called "Those Who Chant." When he was living with Valerie in L.A., he got into Nichiren Choshu Buddhism. Valerie was into that. In fact, Valerie was working for Tina Turner at the time. Valerie turned Tina Turner onto that type of Buddhism, which involved chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And Bish wrote a great composition of that. He did a couple of recordings for a label called Black Jazz Records, which was in L.A., LA-based label that featured some recordings by Bish, by Doug Karn, Rudolph Johnson, a lot of fantastic stuff. Mark Menargle says, I think we met at Bish and Barbara's wedding at your place. Yeah, that's right. They got married. Father John Genzel married them at my penthouse apartment, I guess late 70s. Bish is recorded output, a bit sporadic, although he did some great albums for the Muse label. In fact, Soul Village, his first recording for Muse, once again, late 70s. That's the first recording session I ever went to. Randy Brecker, that's when I first met Randy. And I wrote the liner notes for that and his subsequent release, Cubicle. In addition to playing, Bish was a poet. I showed you before his take on Thelonious Monk. Let's look at what he had to say about Max Roach.
There was a roach named Maxwell, a most unusual roach. He could fly, having been born with wings, and he played the drums of all things. He made his way up to the big city. There he hooked up with some other bugs. There was a yard bug. He flew up from Kansas City. And brother, he could play blues on alto like you never heard. They nicknamed him the Bird. There was a bed bug from Cheraw, South Carolina, named Burks. And man, he could play notes on trumpet that would really make you dizzy. Then there was the loneliest bug. You know, to my mind, he was the strangest bug of all. Played piano, wrote music off the wall. Now they say he was born around midnight, and I don't doubt that at all. So these plus some other creatures, they used to congregate in a spot in Harlem called the Uptown Bug House. And man, they created some of the damnedest sounds you ever heard. Soon the other insects spread the word. They proclaimed, a new music is born. Bebop it was called. And you know what? It caught on like wildfire. Grasshoppers, they did the Lindy to it. The jitterbugs waltzed to it. And bugs and roaches came crawling from all over because they wanted to learn it. But actually, you had to earn it. Now society, downtown that is, got word that Harlem was being overrun, infested as it were, with bugs and roaches creating strange new sounds, and decided we must eliminate the creatures lest they filter downtown. So they sent the exterminators, and the exterminators came with pesticides, insecticides, Black Flag, Roach Motel, and others. And they sprayed and they sprayed and they kept on spraying. But these creatures, they were another breed because they prayed and they prayed and they kept on playing. Now do you hear what I'm saying? Instead of dying, they just kept multiplying. So then society decided to bring in the big rock to crush them. Well, let me tell you, it did slow them down quite a bit because they all couldn't survive it. It even left Max in Poco Loco. Couldn't kill Burks, they just made him stronger. Now Thelonious, I'm told, is hidden away in a wall to last a bit longer. The yard bug flew onto the higher ground, but what he left us will always be around. Max, I'm happy to say, is alive and well, playing the song that could not quell. Bebop, forever.
Bish was a bebopper. He wasn't an innovator, but he was a swinging pianist who had a real bluesy, upbeat touch. Walter Davis Jr. kind of took Bud's thing and took it to the next step. You could really hear Bud in Walter Davis Jr. Bish was a touch of Bud, but certainly his contribution theory-wise with his study in fourths was very influential and continues to be. In his later years in the 90s, Bish was married to a lovely Japanese woman, Keiko, and she was responsible for helping him tour Japan. And with those gigs in Japan, he got a lot of the recognition that he did not receive earlier in his life. And sadly, he had cancer, heart attack, died in 1998. And watching these videos, of course, brings back a lot of memories. I remember when I got married, Bish played at my reception. When my daughter was born, he was there. I mean, he was a really good friend, close friend, and I miss him. And his music lives on. So I'm going to close out here with one of the something from a Japanese engagement back in '91, and he was talking earlier about Thelonious Monk. Well, how about Bish playing around midnight? Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next week. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and keep listening to jazz.